Mini might not be setting the sales charts on fire. In fact, they were down 20% in 2024. But for those that are willing to think small, the new Cooper has a lot going on for it. In fact, this might just be the best value in terms of miles per dollar that I have driven in quite some time. I would argue that as a brand, Mini doesn't get as many owners as other brands. Instead, Mini tends to have fans, people that really love the styling, the way that it drives, etc. And with every successive generation of the Cooper, some of those fans have felt abandoned, and then of course some new fans come along. This is the fourth generation of the modern Mini, and it is the most grown-up, most refined, and roomiest, and yes, the biggest Mini Cooper ever created. And that's certainly going to offend a number of Mini traditionalists I know that think this is too big and too heavy and too refined, and of course, too German. But for me, that's part of what makes the fourth generation Mini the best Mini that they've ever made. Well, the best Cooper that they've ever made, because I honestly think if I were to buy a Mini, I would probably go for a Countryman, which has also had a ground-up redesign recently. But some of the things that I like on the Countryman also apply to the Cooper, just in a smaller package. Full LED headlights happen up here, of course, because Mini is not just small, it's a premium small vehicle, and that's the first thing to keep in mind. Whereas once Mini was just affordable transportation, now it's small premium transportation, and you should consider this as more of a cross-shop against something like a Volvo EX30 on the electric side, or a Lexus UX, or any of those other small SUVs and small hatches out there, rather than an alternative to your average Chevy or Nissan or something like that. Full LED headlights, of course, but we also have the LED changing pattern in here for the daytime running lights that we also saw on the Countryman, and of course, the distinctly Mini grille. For this generation, the Cooper did not grow quite as much as it has in other generations. And if we're talking about the two-door model, it's basically the same size as the outgoing model. The four-door version, though, it did get a little bit of a stretch to 158.9 inches long. If you're looking at this, and then you're remembering our recent video on the Countryman, you might be thinking, gosh, they look very, very similar. Well, they do, but the Countryman is notably bigger. It's 17 inches longer, considerably higher, and definitely wider in the passenger compartment area. This is one of the smallest vehicles on sale in North America, certainly one of the smallest 4- or 5-door vehicles, depending on how you want to count that hatchback there. This is actually shorter in terms of length than the Volvo EX30 we recently got. That means it is significantly smaller than something like a Volkswagen Golf. And at 3,089 pounds, it's also one of the lightest things we've driven recently. From this angle, you can see just how small the Cooper is. The roofline doesn't even come up to my shoulder, and something like a Golf would have a higher roofline. We have the practicality, however, of a hatch, and the hatch does open nice and tall, something I appreciate, so taller folks aren't going to bop themselves on that hatch right there, or the latch rather, the latch on the hatch. We have LED taillights, and they are configurable, of course, just like the front. I'll show you that in a moment. Big black bar that runs across there, and at the bottom, interestingly, no visible exhaust tips. The backup light, though, that's right there in the center. No modern Mini would be complete without a hood that wrapped around the headlight, or a modern BMW engine under the hood. This is a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo producing 201 horsepower and 221 pound-feet of torque, sending power to the front wheels via a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission. You'll get 32 miles per gallon combined in this model. If you are looking for a JCW Cooper, that will be found in the 2-door hardtop or 2-door convertible only. Yes, there is going to be a convertible, and you're going to get 228 horsepower, not too much of a bump there, but a whopping 280 pound-feet of torque out of that engine, and an 8-speed dual-clutch transmission, it looks like. This model, however, is not that model. This is the one with the regular engine and a sticker price of $39,795. So definitely not cheap, but not as premium as something like that Lexus UX, even though this is significantly more fun. When it comes to comfort, I found the driver's seat to be excellent. This has a 4-way adjustable lumbar support and a massage program that uses those inflatable bags to just sort of move around on your back and help improve circulation. We also have a tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion. But you should know that unlike some luxury vehicles, we don't have the same range of motion over here on the passenger side. We don't have the massage, and it doesn't offer the lumbar support at all. As you might imagine, the seat controls are fairly BMW, 4-way lumbar support right there, and the memory switches above. The next thing you should know is that the back seat is quite small. This front seat is all the way back in its tracks. As you can see, my legs are really digging in there. you'd have a hard time getting to the other side. And this front seat is adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. You can see it's not really that much further forward. I only have maybe about an inch of legroom there. And if I were to try and go back over to the other side, we do have a center shoulder belt. Woo, but my goodness, those the buckles are stabbing me in the rear end. And it's also like trying to sit on a balance beam because this is really, really narrow inside. There's just one cup holder, but surprisingly, there are two USB-C charge-only ports right there in the center. As far as child seats go, well, you're going to have to be pretty small up front because even though we do get well-positioned latch anchors, very, very easy to find, and yellow, body color matched, kind of a nice touch, you'd be hard-pressed to actually fit a child seat in here with someone up front, especially a rear-facing seat. One isn't just the loneliest number, it's also the number of 24-inch roller bags we were able to squeeze back here in the cargo area. Again, that shouldn't be too much of a surprise, just given the dimensions of the Cooper. If you're looking for that road trip vehicle, you want to take a look at the Countryman. We have this hard-style cargo cover just above that small cargo area, and if we go in for a closer look, we do find some additional storage space under this load floor, but that wasn't enough to bring this up to two 24-inch roller bags. When you jump inside the Cooper, the first thing you're greeted by is this very BMW steering wheel, and that is definitely a good thing for me because I love thickly rimmed wheels. We have a big sport grip up there and a really chunky leather-wrapped design. It's very, very comfortable to drive. Down here we have sort of a spoke. It's actually kind of like seatbelt material with kind of this cool pattern on it. And I love the details that they've done with this interior, from the gold accents to the fabric inserts everywhere. And there are a bunch of different interior color and fabric options depending on the version and, of course, the mini model you're looking at. So if you aren't quite a big fan of this look, you can get something similar but different in the rest of the Mini lineup. One thing common with the other Minis, however, is this big circular infotainment system that I think is really cool because it gives this a very distinctive look. The implementation of CarPlay in the middle is on the small side, but what's intriguing is the entire display actually takes on the CarPlay theme. So if I were to, for instance, go into the settings here and I were to change the wallpaper, I'll go ahead and set that. You'll notice that the entire screen's wallpaper changes because, again, that's being driven by your attached smartphone. That's a really cool touch. The native software interface, it is definitely distinctively Mini, so it doesn't look like iDrive just grafted on here like some of the earlier Minis definitely did. The circular theme is well used, I would say, with readouts up top and the speed limit or speed that you're going right there right on top. The map display in the middle of everything, you can also expand that out and use most of that circular display. It gives me, I don't know, kind of a James Bond theme going on with those moving maps on your watch. Of course, I have an iWatch, so very similar to that. In keeping with that sort of seatbelt buckle theme going on with the steering wheel, we have that over there on the passenger side, big air vents going on there. And at night, we have lights projected from the back of this screen onto the fabric pattern. That is a really interesting twist to ambient lighting because it's a lot less expensive, and I think it actually looks better than a lot of ambient lighting displays I've seen recently. Moving over to the doors, more of that fabric going on there on the upper section of the door. Decent amount of hard plastics, of course. That entire textured part around the speaker grille and the door lock and unlock switch, that's all hard plastic, as is the panel right behind the armrest. This is kind of a squishy, rubbery armrest, and then the rest of the door is hard plastic. This one has the optional Harman Kardon audio system. You can see the speakers up there on the pillars. The glove compartment, it's more of a slot style. I was not able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer inside. It was just a bit too big. Now going up here to the ceiling for a moment, you'll see the controls for the moonroof. It is a 2-pane panoramic moonroof with a twist. So we have one pane there with a separate manual shade, controls for the map lights for the rear passengers, and then a separate pane in the back that does not open but has its own shade. You'll notice that the shade does not block all the light. It does actually allow some light coming through, but I didn't think that was too much of a problem even on the brighter days. Below the big screen, we find some physical buttons and switches. This is P for park, and that is the shifter there. If I could ask for one thing, it might actually be more of a column-style shifter rather than this little toggle. The Experiences toggle is more than just a drive mode selector because it adjusts the theme of the display. So for instance, if I stay in this timeless display, which you haven't seen yet, we'll wait for it to time out there, you'll notice we get more of a classic look to that display. But if I move on up to Vivid, not only do the colors change, but the style of the display readout changes as well. So kind of a cool touch there. And of course, it's going to adjust things like the adaptive dampers and all of that in the vehicle. Below that, we find a wireless charging mat with a little clip to keep your phone in place. That's handy because otherwise it might fly around. Two big cup holders, also a nice touch. We get a storage area here with an optional insertable locked down little lid compartment. This is screwed in place, so if you don't want it, you'd have to unscrew it. Inside we find the latest mini key. There's the lock button right there. You press it 3 times for the auto start. Unlock is oddly enough on the side rather than on the same side as the lock button, and then there's a hatch button right there. This has a very similar sort of seatbelty theme going on, same fabric matching the rest of the interior. Behind that, we find some USB charge-only ports because CarPlay is wireless only in here, and then we find the center console in the middle. It does not open and it does not slide. Out on the road, you're definitely going to notice that this is a front-wheel drive Mini, but I kind of like that because if you want all-wheel drive, there are other Minis to choose from, and there is something classically Mini purist about a front-wheel drive small car. It doesn't really affect the 0 to 60 time, of course, because there's no wheel slip as long as the road is dry, and this one went 0 to 60 in 5.8 seconds. If you want to go faster, there's that upcoming JCW model, but at the moment you can't get it in the 5-door trim. Also solid is the handling ability and the stopping distance. We stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in just 105 feet in this model. That's a very good stopping distance. And what surprised me about it is we did the stopping test and we played around with it on some of these winding mountain roads when it was dry. And then I took a look at the size of the tire, and I was kind of surprised because 215 with tires are pretty darn small. Those are the kind of tires you'd find on something like a base Honda Civic or something along those lines, not a Civic Type R, not anything that you would assume would be this much fun out on the road. And that's possible, of course, because of the relatively light curb weight. Again, all things are relative here. This is a 21st century Mini, and when people poke fun of, how fat it's become, oh, it's 3,000 pounds, etc., these are the kind of people that forget how much all the safety systems and the added structure and the infotainment system and the air conditioning, etc. weigh. And I bet you very few of these people would actually want to live without 21st century modern crash structures and airbags and a head-up display and an infotainment system and air conditioning and a power moonroof, things like that. All of these things add weight, bigger brakes, all of that, turbochargers, the added safety of just the structure of the vehicle itself, things that were not considered when the original Minis were built. And all of that comes at a price. That price is curb weight. But the price is not handling ability in comparison to other 21st century vehicles, because this is an awful lot of fun, whether the road's dry or honestly even when the road's a little damp like it is now in the rain. I'm certainly going to give handling an A, bearing in mind there's really not a lot to compare this against. I would say you could compare most versions of this price-wise to something like a Civic Si or a Civic Type R, an Acura ADX, Lexus UX, a bunch of different hatches like a GTI, maybe a Volvo EX30, something along those lines, but none of those things is like the Mini. The closest thing to the Cooper two-door would be the Fiat 500, sort of, but it's an electric vehicle. It's actually kind of heavy for an EV as well. And then, of course, there's going to be an electric Mini, so that's really more of that Fiat comparison. So numbers aside, grades aside, bear in mind, there's not a lot of direct comparison ability because there really isn't anything else quite like this. And that is a little bit different than a classic Mini, because back then there were more things to directly compare that Mini against, but for a modern Mini, that's very in keeping with the theme. Mini has long marched to a different drummer, and I'm really glad that they're still marching to that same tune. If I were to buy a Mini Cooper, I would definitely select the $500 adaptive suspension option because it really improves rides not just out on rougher gravel roads like this, but in everyday driving as well. This soaks up these small imperfections and larger imperfections like speed bumps much better than I had expected. That's possible, of course, given the light curb weight. That's one of the reasons, of course, that something like the Mazda Miata actually feels so good out on rougher road surfaces, because there's just less mass to damp, which means you don't have to have dampers quite as firm to have the same kind of sporty driving. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not floating on a cloud out here thanks to the adaptive dampers. It still has more of that Mini vibe going on, the modern Mini vibe, I would say. But again, it handles those larger imperfections really well. And if you didn't have the adaptive suspension option, it is definitely more of a tooth knocker. Back out on the paved road, the adaptive dampers are still doing their thing, helping give this that darty go-kart-like ride quality, while also being daily driver livable. That's also a classic Mini trait. Now, speaking of the steering and that go-kart-like handling, the steering ratio is pretty quick, and it's definitely very, very direct. So there's no slop, no wait for the vehicle to turn in. One of the other things that people have liked about the Mini. The steering wheel diameter is also on the small side, and the rim's very chunky, giving this, again, a go-kart or maybe video game-like feel, depending on exactly how you feel about electric power steering. Cabin noise, that is a little bit louder than some of the luxury competition at 73 decibels at 50 miles an hour, but you'll certainly find some louder options out there. Fuel economy, that's pretty decent given the curb weight of this. It's definitely a big factor on the fuel economy front. We averaged 34.5 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving, so this has been out-indexing the EPA score.
You can't really talk about one Mini without talking about practically the rest of the Mini family. So let's go about our pricing and comparison section a little bit differently here. The Mini Cooper is currently available in 2-door, 4-door, or convertible formats. And again, there are going to be different engines depending on the models that you choose. The 2-door model, logically, is going to be the most affordable, starting at $30,125, including destination. Then we get the 4-door at $31,125, and the 2-door convertible as the most expensive form, $35,125. But these price tags are still very reasonable, just going by the average new car transaction price in America, which is over $40,000. So any way you slice it, any Cooper is actually going to be less expensive than the average new car on the road in the US. At least for the moment, the 2-door and the convertible are available in the regular form, just Cooper, the 201 horsepower form, Cooper S, and 221 horsepower in the JCW model. And the convertible all the way along the line is going to be about $5,000 more than the regular 2-door. The 4-door, for some reason, does not come with the JCW engine. And I think I know why that is. I think that's because of how Mini has priced the Countryman, but we'll get to that in just a second. If you get carried away with all the options on the 4-door model, you'll end up at $40,925. Competition for the Mini Cooper, at least in North America, is pretty tricky because we simply don't have the number of small hatchback options here that you still find in Europe. Admittedly, some of those numbers have been dwindling lately, but you still find a decent number more than in the United States. In my opinion, there are a few close competitors here. You could step up into something like a BMW X1 or an X2. Admittedly, that's a pretty big step, but format-wise, that's the closest thing you're going to get. And generally speaking, they're going to be really close to that Mini dealership because most Mini dealers are tied to BMW dealers. I just don't think that's the most direct competitor, however. On the dealer lot with the Mini Cooper, though, is the Mini Countryman. And this is going to be bigger, it's going to be more powerful, it's quicker 0 to 60, about 0.2 of a second faster, thanks to the more powerful engine, and it's going to have all-wheel drive. Definitely big reasons to get the Countryman. But this is why I think we don't have a JCW 4-door, at least not for the moment, because their price tags don't have much overlap. They basically bookend one another. The Countryman starts at $40,075, whereas the Cooper 4-door stops at $40,925. So it's really only about $900 of option overlap there. Now, you can, of course, get your Countryman up much higher than that, but I would say if you're really looking at a Cooper 4-door and you're wondering, do I need a little bit more room, and you're already loading it all the way up anyway, you might want to check out the Countryman. I think it is just a bit more practical. I actually kind of like the addition of all-wheel drive. Mini purists really are not going to like that. But the rest of the Mini Countryman is simply more practical and more usable for daily life than the 4-door Cooper. And, of course, they're all more useful and more practical than the 2-door Mini, but if you want that kind of Mini vibe, then the 2-door is really your only port of call. Except for something like the Fiat 500e. We should talk about that for just one moment. It's arguable that the Fiat 500e is the closest direct competitor to the 2-door Mini that we have in North America. Now, admittedly, it is an electric vehicle, and there are going to be electric Minis coming to the United States, so that would probably be the more appropriate competitor, EV to EV, but that's not where we are, at least for now. The 500e is smaller and tighter on the inside. It doesn't make as good of a use of space, actually, I think, as the current Mini. And that's because even though Fiat is sometimes calling it a dedicated EV platform, wink wink, it's worth noting that it's closely related to previous ICE platforms and upcoming hybrid and plug-in hybrid vehicles that are also going to be using that same platform. So it's really not a dedicated BEV platform. really obvious when you take a look at it, to be perfectly honest. But the important thing about the 500e is that it looks cute, it's cheeky, it's kind of fun to drive, but it's not as fun of a place to spend your time on the inside. It doesn't have the cool OLED screen that's really flat, and everything about the interior just feels a little bit lower rent than in the Mini line. That's something that previously Mini has struggled with over the years here and there. They've done some parts really nicely, and some parts did feel a little bit less expensive. But I would say in the current generation Mini product line, they've really made an effort to make the interior parts quality very consistent and consistently more premium than the average mainstream option. And that brings us along to another EV, but one that I think is more of a direct competitor to the model that we were driving today. That would be, of course, the Volvo EX30. In my mind, this is the best competitor for the 4-door model, or the 5-door model, however you want to count the hatch. In the future, this may be even more of a direct competitor because the rumor mill says that we should expect rear-wheel drive electric Minis at some point in the future. I know that's going to be a bit of a pearl-clutching problem for some Mini fans, but that seems to be the direction that their parent company is going in. At any rate, the EX30 has the hope of being a $36,000 to $37,000 EV once we get the single rear-wheel drive model, single motor rear-wheel drive model on sale in North America. That's going to be built in Belgium sometime in 2025. We're actually probably only about 6 months away from that being in production, so we should start seeing that model really soon. But if you don't want to wait, there is an interesting loophole that you can exploit that we discovered because we recently leased an EX30 just to see how it would be long term. The least expensive dual motor model currently on sale is $46,195. That's a decent amount more than that $36,000 base price. But if you lease it, then you get the lease loophole credit. Well, the Volvo leasing company gets the credit, they pass it down to you. And what's weird and interesting about Volvo leases, we didn't know this until after the documents all arrived and we set up our online account, is that you can lease a Volvo and turn around and purchase it out from the lease on day one, essentially. And that is the way to buy an EX30 and still get the tax credit, even though it wouldn't otherwise qualify for it because it's not built in the United States. And that's because Volvo factors that $7,500 credit in as a cap cost reduction. Now, the lease fees are going to eat up some of that, but you should still get about $6,000 off, dropping the price of that dual motor model down to about the same price as the 5-door Mini Cooper that I was driving this week. And I think that's an apt comparison. The Volvo is going to be significantly swifter. It's going to handle really well. Not as well as the Mini, to be honest, because of the weight of the battery pack. But that low center of gravity certainly makes the Volvo a surprising amount of fun. The Volvo's pretty roomy. I think actually it has a better proportion, better space utilization in the second row, but the Mini feels more premium in many areas. The way that Volvo got to that low price tag with the expense of the battery and the electric motors was to delete some creature comforts on the inside, like no air vents in the second row. You also don't have speakers in the back of most of the models. The one that we got does, but the sound system sounds kind of hollow because there are no speakers in the doors. It's just a sound bar in the dashboard. So the sound system in the Mini is definitely better. I also definitely prefer the funky vibe that we have in the Mini cabin versus the more sedate and restyled vibe that we have in the Volvo. They both have just one big screen in the dashboard, but there's something cute and cheeky about the round dial that we find in the Mini. I think it's a little bit less functional than the big Volvo rectangular one, but it looks better in the dashboard. And then, of course, there's the reality that Mini didn't delete a whole bunch of switches. So you have the big screen, but you got a lot of switches and toggles and buttons and window switches, etc., that you just don't get in the Volvo. On the other hand, you do get a lot of power and you get all-wheel drive and the convenience of an all-electric drivetrain in the Volvo. So I have to admit, if I were shopping between these and I was looking for a fully loaded version of the Mini Cooper 4-door one, mind you, I would probably end up getting an EX30, as long as you could get your hands on one that is. They're pretty limited availability at the moment. On the other hand, if I were to Mini, I would want to go all the way to a 2-door Mini, probably the JCW, because that is the most Mini interpretation for me, and I would probably get the convertible. And really, there's nothing like that in America, and that's what I really love about the Mini product line. Now, I will caution you, if you've had a Mini for a few years and you're shopping for this Mini, there's not quite as much customization available, I think because Mini realized that the number of options and features and independent check boxes that you can check were just getting out of control, so they did try to streamlined things and that has reduced the customization ability. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. Be sure and find us on EV Buyer's Guide, the podcast. Of course, you can find us on your major podcasting platforms. Hit that subscribe button, the like button, etc. if you haven't already done so. I'll see all of you next week.